cymbals, and I tend to get a good sound with, is the spaced pair and the XY miking technique. And that involves using two microphones for a stereo image, and you want them to be matched. You want condenser microphones because they're more sensitive to high frequency sounds, and I can explain why later. But you also want to have them sounding the same. You don't want one microphone having a muddier tone and just won't sound proper in your mix. So normally what I do is I'll place them over the kit, one over the ride, one over the hi-hats, equally spaced from the snare being the center of your sound image for the kit. That's normally what your sound engineers will do, is they'll make the snare centered in the stereo mix and build the kit from that. So having the match pair over the hi-hat and ride, if you EQ them properly and pan them properly, you won't have any phase issues, and I'll talk about phase later. You want to make sure they're the same distance over the snare so that the sound arrives at each mic at the same time. Otherwise you'll get a delay, like a reverb echo sound in your recording. There's also an XY pattern, which is placing the microphone capsules as close together as possible over the center of the snare. And this microphone will be shooting to one side and this one will be shooting to the opposite. And because the capsules are close enough, most of the drums and cymbals will be hitting the microphones at the same time, so there's less chance of phase issues, phase cancellation and echoes and that sort of thing. So this is what phase offsets will look like between microphones. The more microphones you use, the more phase issues you will have. The more distance you have between the microphones, the more this problem becomes an issue. So here it is lined up. This is an overhead microphone and a close mic on the snare drum. And you can see that the sound is reaching the overheads later than the direct close mic on the snare. And if it's too much of a delay, it's going to be shifted over so much that when these signals add together, they're going to start subtracting. So you're going to get some of the frequencies in the snare removed. It's going to sound weaker. It's also going to sound very distant, like you're in a cave because of all these reflections causing a reverb effect. So by placing a filter on the overheads, you can cut out the frequencies coming up from the snare drum and only get the top end, higher end frequencies, which will make the cymbals sound crisper and leave the snare mid and low frequencies alone, which will give you a more powerful sound. Some of the things you can do to reduce these reflections is use sound treatment, like Mike has talked about several times. We're not soundproofing the room, but we're treating the surfaces of the room so the signal doesn't bounce around and come back into the microphone. What happens with the sound is when you hit your cymbal or snare or whatever, the sound is going to come off the drum directly and hit the mic first. At the speed of sound, it will go from the snare skin up to the microphone. The pressure waves will create the pulse and it will record. But those pressure waves and sounds will bounce off walls, ceilings, other objects in the room and come back to the microphone. So you can use sound absorbing material like Mike does at the kit and around the walls. The type of foam will absorb the sound. It will also deflect it, as if you notice, they're like triangular shaped cones on the foam itself, and that takes the direct signal coming off the mic. Instead of coming back to the microphone, it's going to deflect it down or up. It's also going to attenuate the sound because it's getting absorbed. So by the time it reflects off that surface, goes to the floor, bounces back up to the microphone, it's lost so much energy that it's not really going to make that much of a difference. And if it's done properly, it shouldn't really bleed at all into the other microphones. So you'll also notice, if you've been in studios, the higher end studios, the ceilings are not parallel to the floor, the walls are not square, they're angled. I forget what the measurements are. There's certain degrees that you can use that will prevent the signals from coming back. So a lot of these expensive studios will spend quite a bit of money and time designing the room so that the sound doesn't reflect all over and create standing waves and just ruin the recording. So there's quite a bit to learn. I know this is just basic stuff, but take into account, if you want to use some of these techniques to make your sound better, throw up some blankets, grab some foam, use the proper microphone as well. You don't want to be using an omnidirectional microphone on a tom, because it'll pick up the next tom, it'll pick up the snare, it'll pick up everything around it. So make sure you pay attention to the type of microphone, dynamic or condenser normally used. You don't want to be using like ribbons and these very sensitive microphones, because certain drums can actually ruin the diaphragms. Don't place a condenser microphone in your kick drum. There's quite a bit of air movement there, and it will either clip the microphone, or it'll slam the signal right to the roof and distort, or you just won't sound good. And drum mics, tom, snares are almost always dynamic types. You can also mix in condensers. That makes a really good sound as well. So just keep in mind, I've had some questions. People are wondering why their mixes sound so weak. It's because you're getting a lot of bleed from all the microphones. You might be using the wrong kind. So instead of using an omnidirectional, look for a cardioid pattern, which is a more narrow pickup pattern. You can use hypercardioid, which is even more narrow than the cardioid. You can use gates electronically to open and close the mic at a certain sound level, sound pressure level, and that way you're not getting bleed off from the cymbals and other drums, and that's tough to set up. If you don't do it properly, you're going to cut off a lot of the attack and sustain of the drum. So without getting too complex, you want to use a dynamic microphone designed for the bass drum. Usually insert it inside the bass drum, normally a hole in the front skin that allows you to place a microphone in there, within about 6 inches from the batter head and almost pointed directly at the center of the skin. Gets you a really good sound. For snare, for close miking, the SM57s are very popular. They sound really nice. I've got a CAD microphone here, which is probably half the price. They've done a very good job of replicating the SM57. And tom mics, mostly used with dynamic type microphones, but I've seen condensers on there as well, and like I say, they give you a really good sound. And cymbals, almost always condenser type